get things started and recognizing that we are joining from all different time zones and have probably had all different kinds of days or nights and are starting at different points in time, I'm going to get you guys to put your names into the chat and kind of what you're working on at the moment. But I also want you to put a number between 1 and 8 based on the kind of day you've either about to have or you've just had, okay? So I'm going to share my screen. So first of all, sometimes I certainly feel like my days are like this, right? So puddling water, doing good hard work, but probably not making too much of a difference, all right? So that's day type number 1 that we've got. All right. Day type number 2, and I must admit this feels a little bit like 15 minutes before getting to this session as well, is rapidly running out of time to get things completed, really pumping out that last PowerPoint presentation before you get to the next call or the next conference you've got. So that's number 2. Okay, number 3, I think you could interpret this a couple of different ways. First of all, if you're in the fundraising game, sometimes hustling for money can look a little bit like this. But sadly, this is actually more of a commentary on sort of public service delivery these days. This is a bunch of school teachers in South Dakota where they have to hustling up $1 notes as part of a halftime ice hockey show to be able to collect classroom supplies for their students. So you can interpret that one however you like, but that's number 3. Number 4, sometimes you might just be feeling a bit bullish, ignoring exactly what's going on around you, and you're just trying to get stuff done, right? So nothing's going to hold you back. You're just going to get on with that role as well. So that's number 4. All right, let's see what the next one is. Number 5, this one's one of my favorites, and I don't know if anyone's watched the recent HBO series, but this is a dead zombie bug, right? So a completely hollowed out bug that's actually being controlled by fungi. And sometimes you can feel like that you're traipsing through your inbox / the kind of day full of calendar meetings and you're not really there. In fact, maybe you have just been a hollowed out zombie controlled by fungi. So that's number 5. Let's see what we've got as number 6. Sometimes you can just have a really hectic day where you're not quite sure whether you need to laugh or cry, right? So this is day type number 6. I don't know if anyone's ever been on those teacup rides at Disney, but they do induce this kind of reaction in my experience. So that's day type number 6. Okay, day type number 7. Maybe you're just waking up. Maybe your calendar is clear for today and you can be having a luscious, relaxed, thoughtful, peaceful sleep in the kelp like this seal is having. So that's day type number 7. And then day type number 8, maybe you're at the back end of a very long period or a mission or a trip, and the world is spinning around you, but you're just a little bit zoned out. And that's day type number 8. All right. So very quickly, day type number 1, bucket in water, not making a difference, feeling like you're not making a difference. Day type number 2, finishing your slides with 15 minutes to go on the back of a motorcycle. Day type number 3, either hustling for cash or feeling like you're part of a system that's really, really broken. Day type number 4, what have we got here? Bulldozing through that list, that to-do list of yours, not letting anything stop you. Number 5, the zombie bug. They're moving, but not really there. Number 6, what have we got? Yeah, the teacups, feeling like everything's a little bit too hectic and you don't know whether to laugh or cry. Day type number 7, peaceful seal sleeping in kelp. And day type number 8, hamster, totally zoned out. So as a very quick way so we can know who's on this call and the fact that this is a working group meeting and a chance to connect, if you just stick in chat your name, if you want to put your organization, if that makes sense, or if you've got a way of identifying yourself and any kind of work or interest or something that you've been reading in this space of subnational governance, decentralization, local level governance, that would be fantastic and would really appreciate that. I am definitely going to go with number 2, the guy on the back of the bike, because that's definitely felt like my thing. Mark Ellery, number 1, excellent. Okay, and who else have we got? We've got a 4, we've got a 7. Okay, so 7's pretty good. Peaceful kelp, that's pretty good, Glenn. I'm glad to hear that. The number 1 mark was the bucket in water. That's a little bit depressing. Nick, we've got The guy on the back of the bike, excellent. Mudvies are 6, so I think that was the P-cup girl. So lovely. Thank you very much, guys, for sharing that. And I do encourage you, particularly later in the session, where we've got space for questions and also open discussion for any topics that people want to raise around the work that they've been doing in this space. That would be great. All right, I'm going to stop now and hand over to the ever lovely Nick Travis, who's going to give us a bit of an update on the Logica assessments that have been undertaken. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Peter, and good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. Actually, I selected number 2, the guy on the motorbike, but I actually didn't get round to finishing any PowerPoint for this, so I guess maybe that pushes me into a different category, I'm not sure, but that's normally how I feel. So I'm going to give a very brief update on progress that we've been making on the Logica assessments. So I'm just going to, I mean, some of you will already know that over the past few months, I think in January when we had the last working group meeting, we discussed the ongoing project that we've been doing as in LPSA around intergovernmental profiles. So some of you may have seen on the LPSA website, I'm just going to share my screen, the section devoted to what we call the Logica intergovernmental profile. And this is part of LPSA's Logica methodology, which is a sort of suite of tools that looks at intergovernmental issues in countries around the world. And really, it's the sort of initial entry-level analytical tool that seeks to pretty much look at 2 things, or in some circumstances 3. But what we're trying to do is come up with a brief profile that is publicly available for all countries in the world, that looks at, you know, basically the administrative structure of the subnational public sector in every country. And then the nature of those subnational governance institutions at the various different levels and tiers of the public sector. And this may sound, you know, very obvious and rudimentary in many ways, but what we found is that when people talk about the public sector, the subnational governance structures in a particular country, often, you know, the generic term local government or regional government is used, but in reality, the nature of those entities across countries differs very significantly in terms of the level of autonomy and authority and decision-making power that those subnational governance entities have in practice. Often there's a big difference between what the legal framework says about how much powers a particular government entity has versus what they have in practice. So that's sort of what we've been doing, and we've been doing this around different regions. And if you on the website, if you click on the link to the different profiles, you'll come to a web page where you can see the various different regions that we've been looking at, and in particular, we've been focusing on Africa, Asia, and the Latin American region. And so if you click on the various sections here, you'll come up with a list of countries. Some have links to where the profiles have been completed, and others have not yet been completed, but will be hopefully fairly soon. And essentially what we're doing, as I said, is looking at the basic structure of subnational governance in a country and assigning those entities to different categories, depending on the nature of those various entities, ranging from, you know, fully devolved subnational governments with extensive powers on one extreme, where you know, we assess those entities as being, you know, fully empowered, genuine local governments, all the way through to the other extreme, where we simply say that they are not devolved, they are not fully devolved, they are not genuinely devolved local governments. perhaps they're deconcentrated administrations or simply some other type of institution. And then a couple of categories in between, either properly devolved governments with limited powers, or some kind of hybrid institution that has features of both devolved and non-devolved entities. So they might have political, there may be political decentralization, but not really sufficient fiscal decentralization to enable that power to exhibit properly. And we can't go through the methodology in this short segment, but of course there is that is available online if people are interested. So I've been working on trying to do this assessment. And just as maybe as an example, if we just click on one of the profiles here, just to show you what the sort of the ultimate product is for each country. So this is just Indonesia. So here the profile talks a little bit, basically sets out the basic structure of subnational governance in Indonesia. So you have the various levels at provincial, local level, and lower local level, and the equivalent entities at each level. And then they're color coded according to whether they're devolved, whether they're non-devolved, whether they're hybrid, or so on. So you get this sort of basic information about the structure, the number of entities, the nature of those entities. And then there's a sort of a summary write-up that follows that talks about the structure in a bit more detail, and then the nature of those entities and why they've been assigned those colors, and then a bit about the functional assignments as well. And then you get the link to the full, this is sort of the summary content, and then you get the links to the full report and the Excel template, which sets out a whole list of questions that the answers to which determine the details above, plus a few additional resources from other websites, other institutions that are useful in terms of supplementary knowledge to what we've got here. So that's kind of what we're trying to do for every country in the region, and we're doing this in a few different places, not just in Asia, as I said, but also in other regions. And the ultimate objective is to have got this in place for all countries in the world. So since January, when we kicked this off really for the Asia region, Lima and I have been spending a bit of time lining up local experts to carry out these assessments. That's another important point. I should mention that these profiles are being conducted not by us directly at the Secretariat, although we do provide guidance and methodological support, and we do review, of course, all of the outputs before they're published. But almost all of these profiles are initially carried out by a local expert in each of the countries. We then so that's the first task that we've been doing, is trying to find suitable people to do this, and then we work with them to explain the methodology and the approach, and then the researcher carries out the initial draft, and then we review it, finalize it, and upload it. So we've been doing that, and it's good that I think all but 2 countries so far we've found an expert, and the report or the analysis is ongoing, and that's taken a bit of time to set up and get going. But now I think apart from 2, the profiles are now in development. So hopefully by the time we have the next EWG, this page that we have here, listing all the profiles, there'll be far more profiles in blue than there are now. I'm pretty confident that we should have most of them uploaded within the next 3 months. The 2 countries, by the way, where we've struggled to find experts, I think Lima will correct me if I'm wrong, but it's Mongolia and Singapore. So if anybody does know a good Mongolian or Singapore expert on subnational governance and decentralization that could be suitable to help us working with this, then we would be grateful for any suggestions. I think we've got most of the other countries covered, more or less. But yeah, by the middle of this year, we're hoping that most of the profiles be complete. And then we'll be doing a comparative analysis report where we take all the results from these various profiles and compare and contrast and find trends and differences across the region in the various issues that either promote or inhibit effective decentralization in the region. We recently completed a report on that for a partial initial assessment in the Africa region, looking at 6 countries there, which is also available on the website if people are interested in looking at how the report might look for this region. And then I guess that will be launched and discussed either at the next meeting or perhaps another meeting of the EWG or other venues. So yeah, that's basically where we are. A lot of these profiles are ongoing, and it can take a while to sort of finalize due to the details that need to be verified and so on. But we're making good progress, and hopefully by the next meeting, most of these countries will be completed, and we can talk a bit more about the findings. I'll leave it there for now. I hope that gives you a brief snapshot into what we're doing. And yeah, happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. Thanks a lot.
All right.
And yeah.
Thank you so much, Nick. Really appreciate it. And if people, haven't had a chance to check out those profiles, they're well worth doing it. A great standardizing tool and comparative tool, as well as being able to dig into the nature of a specific country as well. So thank you, Nick. And if anyone's got any questions, we'll have our open question section at the end of the session too. Great. We'll move on to our next agenda item, where I have the pleasure of introducing Via Vajna, who's the head of municipal law and policy with Janagraha. Vajna is heads up the law and policy program at Janagraha. Her work spans municipal legislation, urban policy, thought leadership, and advocacy focused on city systems. She's been working closely with tiers of governments to advocate for systemic urban reforms in India for over 8 years. She leads the development and creation of one of India's flagship reports on urban governance, titled The Annual Survey of India's City Systems, or ASICs, and that's what she's here to talk about tonight and today, which we're very grateful for. And also the associated policy reform engagements with governments that stem from it. She also leads the seed phase of Janagraha's City Leaders Program, a systematic councillor leadership development program focused on women. Vajna, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really grateful to have you come and share, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to introduce ASICs 2023 to all of you. I'll just screen share the presentation. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So I would be presenting to you about the flagship study that Janagraha undertakes, which is Annual Survey of India City Systems, ASICs 2023, which was released in October 2023, actually. So before we get to the agenda of today's conversation, I thought I'll just quickly introduce what Janagraha is. We are a 22+ years organization with the mission of transforming quality of life in India's cities and towns. We are, 100+ in terms of employees, spread across 5 locations in India, working across the Union Government, Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, and 4 state governments in the country. We're actually part of a larger group, which is called as the Jana Group, which actually has 3 other organizations. It's Jana Urban Space, which handles urban planning and design, Jana Small Finance Bank, which provides banking services for urban poor, and Jana Aadhaar, which takes care of affordable housing. Janagraha, with the mission of transforming quality of life in India's cities and towns, works at one end with the citizens to catalyze active citizenship, and also work with the government to catalyze systemic reforms. So the agenda for the day is essentially to introduce you to ASICs, and which we're going to start with the first aspect, which is patterns of India's urbanization, which is essentially what ASICs has tried to do in its latest edition is basically to identify certain urbanization patterns and trends that's currently happening in India, primarily driven through Census 2011. New census is due and yet to be initiated. So Census 2011 is the latest data that is available. And the agenda, I mean, the sort of aim here was also to see quite often we see the trends and patterns of urbanization in the form of a challenge, right? But we sort of, when we place these urbanization trends and challenges along with the governance reality of the country, quite often we could see certain possibilities of coming up with innovative solutions to some of the governance challenges that the country is facing, which is why we decided this year, even as we embark on the core ASICs work, which I'll be explaining to you in a bit, but we also start with the trends and urbanization patterns. And the first trend that we observed is that India currently is 31% urban as per Census 2011, and we have two definitions of urban. One is statutory towns, which are essentially those areas which are recognized by law. And then there are census towns, which are defined by census, as you can see in the LHS, through three criteria. A minimum population of 5,000, at least 75% of the main working population engaged in non-agriculture pursuits, and finally a population density of at least 400 persons per square kilometer. So accordingly, we actually have 318 million people, urban residents, in 4,041 statutory towns and 54 million people in 3,892 census towns. And the 31% that we are saying India is urban is a combination of both statutory towns and census towns. And there is a catch here. Statutory towns are essentially areas that are governed as urban, right? So it actually has an urban local government. Census towns, however, although already displays urbanization, urban characteristics, is often governed as rural. And this actually poses significant challenges in terms of efficient planning and even preparing certain rural areas to become urban as well, because it most often happens in a very ad hoc manner. And secondly, there is a problem of the measurement. I mean, you're not even actually quantifying how urban India is to actually solve for the challenges. So there is a larger issue of measurement itself, because there are several studies that sort of identify that India's definition of urban could be far more stringent. So, if you go just by statutory definition, then India is just 26% urban. If you go by census definition, which is basically statutory plus census towns, India would be 31% urban. But if we apply the definition of Ghana, which is 5,000 plus population, India is already 47%. And if we apply Mexico's definition, which is 2,500 plus population, India could have been 65% urban in census 2000, in 2011. So also there are also contemporary factors such as data on mobility, labor markets, or using nighttime data, etc., which could be explored in defining urban. So we basically propose that it is quite important that necessary assessments need to be done to sort of figure out what is the right way to define urban, which is fundamental to quantify the problem itself and to approach solutions to different challenges. Second thing is, we discussed there are 4,041 statutory towns, right? And these are distinct units of city governments in the country. But when we did a spatial analysis of cities in India, city governments in India, we sort of realized that it's not necessary that we need to see these different city governments as 4,000 plus distinct units. So if we look at the categorization of city governments in terms of population, 1/3 of India's urban population essentially lies in million plus cities, in more than 100K population and less than 100K population. And we also realize there are about 470 urban clusters in the country. This is a combination of statutory towns and census towns. And within 60-kilometer radius of a million plus city, there are at least 50% of Indians residing. And similarly, in 60-kilometer radius of a 1 lakh plus city, the 92% of urban India, urban India essentially resides there. So this sort of a spatial pattern is quite useful for the country to explore probably solutions like, say, a municipal shared services model, especially in less than 100K cities, which already suffer from fast-paced urbanization. By default nature, their capacities are quite weak. The number of municipal workforce that is available to deliver municipal service delivery is already quite weak. And the ability of the city to generate a revenue because of its modest economic base is also another reality. So it's probably not a very feasible idea to sort of create capacities at every single less than 100K city. So the spatial pattern sort of helps us in imagining certain shared services model, for example. Similarly, million plus cities already have legacy benefits. You already have better quality infrastructure and service delivery. They have better economic impulse naturally because of the agglomeration economies and relatively better capacities, which means the possibilities of metropolitan areas could also be quite well harnessed because of the spatial pattern that India's urbanization holds, and which actually offers a very interesting way to probably resolve for some of the challenges the country is facing today. Another interesting trend that we noticed was when we analyzed the urbanization trends across districts. Now, earlier I mentioned that there are 470 urban clusters, including census towns and statutory towns in the country. So when seen through the lens of spatial contiguity, these urban clusters cannot be recognized as administrative units because this could spill over districts and sometimes even various states, right? So therefore, district becomes as a very elegant way of looking it as a distinct unit of governance in some sense, because district is a recognized administrative unit. You have a bureaucrat like a district collector, who's basically heads the district administratively. And already a lot of, like, if say, for example, during the pandemic situation, or if there is a disaster management situation that comes across, it is a district collector who already would sort of, ensure a coordinated, coherent approach of, relief measures or response to disaster itself by sort of bringing together different local government agencies and state departments within a district to respond to such challenges. So that already exists, right? So, therefore, district is already an existing, well-recognized administrative unit. And we often look at urbanization percentages from a state perspective. So when you look at a lot of states, like say, for example, Uttar Pradesh or Assam or Bihar, these are states which are generally seen as states which are not as urbanized. They're quite low urbanized states. However, when we sort of double click further to look at the district rate of urbanization, we realize that about 21 districts from the 8 states with low levels of urbanization actually has significantly higher rates of urbanization, which means a lot of urbanization is sort of getting hidden in the state aggregate figures, and we're sort of not recognizing the rapid urbanization that is happening in certain pockets of within these states, right? So in our analysis, we sort of realized that in the 640 districts as per Census 2011 in India, there are 181 districts which are more urban than the national average. And 72 districts are actually significantly more urban than their state average. By significantly more urban, we mean more than 15% urban compared to the state's average. And of these 72 districts, like I said earlier, 21 are from states which are with low levels of urbanization. So it's quite important to look at this reality and also ensure that these districts, these highly fast, rapidly urbanizing districts, are not becoming blind spots in India's urban policy discourse. And we need to co-read it with the fact that already district collector, so basically the administrative head of a district, already has a recognized role in various, in sort of streamlining various responses within the district. And also when we sort of analyze the municipal legislations across the country, we realize that district collectors also play a critical role in urban governance as well, especially in smaller cities with regards to financial management, approvals, planning to some extent, and so on and so forth as well. So it's a very elegant structure that could be explored further. And these three observations that we just discussed sort of made us think a lot more about integrated approach to rural and urban, essentially, because currently there is a sort of siloed approach distinctly seeing rural and urban essentially. And there is an increasing pattern that's getting visible in India, that there is a rural urban continuum that's getting developed. Like, for example, a state like Kerala is actually in a continuum. And a lot of urban industrial sectors or industrial corridors are getting developed in rural hinterlands, right? So that's one thing. And another important aspect is that the socio-economic aspects quite often is beyond these artificially drawn boundaries or differentiation between rural and urban. And there are a lot of interlinkages that happen between these two areas. So it's quite important. How do we basically explore an integrated place-based approach instead of sort of artificially distinguishing between rural and urban? So this is another thought that A6 2023 puts forth, analyzing the urbanization trends and patterns in India. Now, moving on to the second part of the report. So one thing that we have been observing, JNNURM, Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, was the first flagship urban mission in the country in 2005. And from then, over years, there has been a massive increase in the outlays to urban. So when we analyze the budgetary allocation to Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, which is at the union level, approximately there has been an increase of about 488% of outlays from a period of 2009-10 to 21-22, which is great. However, when we sort of look at the key urban missions and schemes, a lot of it, and this is what we're speaking from, is from union government's end in the country. And another important factor to keep in mind is that in India, so basically there's a union government, there's state government, and then there are local governments, which are rural and urban in nature. Local government is essentially a state subject. So union governments can only provide larger guidelines about how cities can be managed, therefore, and cannot be as prescriptive ideally, right? So therefore, these union government missions were largely sort of focused at service delivery across. So if you take all the key missions, Swachh Bharat mission, for example, was focused on solid and liquid waste. Amrut mission was on basic infrastructure in cities, and there was like lot of emphasis on public transportation, metro rail networks, etc., and which also sort of encouraged the different state governments also to pick up urban as an important agenda. But unfortunately, what has happened is the focus has been substantially on infrastructure and service delivery. Now, as part of JNNURM and Amrut, there has been certain systemic reforms, which are basically mandatory reform conditions, which are part of the mission itself. However, what has happened is that it sort of gave a sort of push to state governments to take reforms more seriously. I mean, that process, that effort sort of lasted only to avail the funds which should come from the mission, and such efforts were not largely institutionalized. So what we are basically seeing is that there has been a substantial improvement in the focus towards urban service delivery and infrastructure, but we don't see as much efforts towards systemic reforms. And what Janagraha sees as the fundamental nature of urban challenges is that it is highly systemic in nature, and essentially the different kinds of quality of life issues that we face, be it the traffic congestion or air quality or a lack of affordable housing options, etc., these are essentially like a tip of an iceberg. Obviously, these are things that we experience on a day-to-day basis. These are tangible issues, but there is a reason why this is emerging at the first place, right? There's a root cause to this, which are mostly non-tangible things. These are things that we don't experience, that we don't get to see, and this is what we call as city systems or urban governance. And this is a term that's been coined by Janagraha. And the city systems that basically has 4 components: urban planning and design, which is about how plans are prepared, implemented, enforced. And given that we're a democratic society, how citizens are engaged in the planning process of the city. Second is urban capacities and resources. This comes from the aspect of financial capacity, capacities in terms of human resources. And third, use of information technology for better process efficiency in city governments. Third is empowered and legitimate political representation, essentially how empowered are the mayors and councils. And the last is transparency, accountability, and citizen participation. So what we say is that all of these 4 components need to come together for the city to have a robust city systems, for the city to have a robust urban governance system, so that the city is able to deliver a good quality of life to its citizens. A6 assessment is basically based on city systems framework. It evaluates the quality of governance in cities by assessing the quality of laws, policies, institutions, and institutional processes that would together help a city govern them. So A6 2023, the assessment period, the core work, which is analysis of municipal laws and town and country planning acts across India, fundamentally sort of spanned across a period of 1 year. And we covered the entire country, essentially 28 states and 7 union territories, excluding Lakshadweep, which does not have a city government as of now. So we covered 82 municipal acts across the country, 44 town and country planning acts, 176 allied acts, rules and notifications, 32 policy schemes and other documents, across 52 questions and 100 plus parameters. Now, to make A6 more relevant, we also analyzed additional data sets, of which one is Census 2011, and we sort of discussed the key urbanization trends and patterns we observed through such analysis. We also analyzed some of the implementation level aspects of the law-based questions that we were evaluating. And also analyzed the CAG reports, which is the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, the supreme audit institution of this country, which has taken a very interesting audit analyzing the implementation of 74th Constitution Amendment Act across states in the country. 74th Constitution Amendment Act is a foundational legislation which basically lays the framework for urban governance in India, which is then emulated by state governments through their respective municipal legislations, in adherence to the principles and guidelines of the 74th Constitution Amendment Act. So, and such several 25 additional data sets have been also part of A6 2023. Now, A6 was an effort that was initiated in 2013, where we started this by evaluating 11 cities, and over years, we have sort of tried to sharpen the methodology as well as to improve the representativeness of the cities in the country. So until 2013 to 2017, city was the unit of analysis. And our aspiration is to have every single city government of the country to be measured through A6, and which obviously will have to be in a phased manner. And this year, we decided, okay, the next step could be that we evaluate the entire breadth of municipal legislations and town and country planning acts and cover the entire country first. So this edition of A6 is more a reflection of state governments, because legislations in that sense are a product of state governments. So that is how A6 2023 largely fits in terms of its methodology and approach. And what A6 2023 identifies is that there are 5 systemic challenges that need to be addressed for cities to deliver a good quality of life. And the pace of the systemic reforms in India's cities has also been painfully slow, and that our cities are caught in a bad status quo. The first systemic challenge is that there is a lack of modern contemporary framework of spatial planning of cities and design standards for public utilities. Some of the highlights are like 39% of state capitals in India do not have active master plans. These are basically, there might be cities where the plan has been lapsed and the government might have notified saying that the old plan can continue, but it just doesn't make sense because the plan does not speak to the contemporary challenges or realities of the city. Similarly, not even a single state or union territory in the country have mandated street and public design standards for their cities. The second challenge is weak finances of cities, both in terms of financial sustainability and financial accountability. Only 20% of municipal expenditure in India is covered by property tax. And property tax is a significant, is the primary tax revenue source for any city government in the country. And around 90% of 4,700 plus cities in India do not have a digital system to track the physical and financial progress of infrastructure projects in the country. The third systemic challenge is poor human resource management. 36% is the average vacancy in city governments, and 14 out of 35 states or UTs, only 14 states UTs basically mandate any kind of training for their municipal officials. Fourth is that the mayors and councillors in India are quite powerless, and there is also, and because, I mean, as a derivative of that, there is also severe fragmentation of governance across municipalities, parastatal agencies, or civic agencies and state departments that happens in every city in India, because there is no one single political authority that is sort of accountable for the city. So what we found is that only 42% of the 74th Constitution Amendment Act has been implemented by states, and 1,400 plus cities, including bigger cities like Bangalore and Mumbai, even as we speak today, do not have elected councils, something which never happens in case of a state assembly. 53 metropolitan areas, essentially urban agglomerations identified through Census 2011, are actually governed by 200 plus municipalities, civic agencies, state departments, and even panchayats. So sort of signaling the extent of fragmentation of governance that's happening. And the final observation is absence of systematic citizen participation and transparency. Like only 3 states UTs have mandated public consultation on city budgets. Only 11 states have enacted public disclosure law, which sort of mandates putting out key civic information, key financial and operational information out on the public domain. And only 5 states have enacted the community participation law, which is essentially to form ward committees and area sabhas to bring governance closer to people and to have institutionalized platforms for citizen participation in cities. So that's just 5 states that has notified rules, which is important for the implementation, and whether the implementation itself is another question. It actually doesn't happen in most cases. So what A6 is trying to sort of do is sort of keep the observations from the governance, understanding of the strength of legislation, sort of also aided by the additional data analysis, and look at the trends, patterns of urbanization. And what we are saying is that looking at the current requirement of India, the reality of its fast-paced urbanization, the systemic nature of reforms has not actually picked up. And we sort of, in what India requires to unleash its urban transformation is essentially to sort of deliberate a path, like a deliberate middle path in that sense, which is not to get caught up with, mayor with, unlimited powers, or just get caught up in band-aid solutions, but like have a pragmatic middle path. And we sort of therefore propose the 10 instruments of change, which can catalyze urban transformation in India. And these 10 instruments of change are the key highlights of A6 2023 report, sort of re-emphasizing that there is a long-term strategic view of urban transformation required in India, even as we continue to have a focus on short-term projects. And like we were discussing about how different city governments are different, the contexts are different. So it's very important that we sort of adapt these these ideas of transformation to the context, by states and by type and size of cities, and leverage these 10 levers of change. Essentially, there are these 10 instruments of change where if you look at the report, and my colleague Priyanka, who's also co-author to this report, who's part of this meeting today, will be able to share the link to the report. So if you look at that, you will actually see these 10 instruments discussed with a description of the instrument, target outcomes and actions that are required from the union government, the state government, and city government to accomplish these 10 instruments. So these 10 are spatial development plans, street and public space design standards, constitutional amendment to empower cities, metropolitan governance, empowered mayors and councils, open cities and participatory budgeting, municipal taxation and transfers, municipal borrowings and audited financial statements, digital public finance management, and municipal shared services and cadre and recruitment rules. So there is a significant lack of spatial planning and design standards in our country. So devolution of planning as a function itself hasn't actually happened from state government to city governments, because there is only one state which actually, at least by law, has sort of recognized the role of city governments in planning. There is a problem across the planning pie, as we call it, which is the plan preparation, implementation, and enforcement. So robust spatial planning is sort of absent in most states, with only 7 states mandating 3 levels of STPs, regional, municipal, and ward level plans. And there is the provisions of ensuring robust enforcement of spatial development plans or design standards to deter any plan violations is also quite weak. That in addition to the issues of planning, there is also a complete absence of street design standard mandates for cities in the country. So what we're saying is that there should be spatial development plans which are prepared, implemented, enforced based on contemporary planning legislations, which are based on the framework that integrates 4 E's, which are essentially economy, equity, environment, and engagement. So some of the key actions that we're recommending is to have, is basically to review and implement the recommendations of high-level planning committee, which has been formed by the government. There's also National Urban Spatial Planning Spatial Planning and Design Guidelines, which has been created as part of JNNURM by our sister organization, Jana Urban Space Foundation. To review and adopt such guidelines, and state governments could set up a program specifically for small and medium cities to have their capacities better built to create spatial plans as well, and to overhaul town and country planning acts basis NUSPD guidelines. And we have city governments to have effective systems to monitor, report, and penalize STP violations, and also have process to ensure public consultation and planning, which is also something that we identified as a major gap in currently how plans are prepared in India. Second is to have good public space design standards, particularly to begin with roads, because roads are essentially not just spaces for vehicles, but that's where we walk. That's also a utility that sort of holds other trunk infrastructure like stormwater drain, bus stands, etc. So it's really important that there are proper design standards for that, because what we often observe in India cities is that road is a significant cost for, like a expenditure for city governments. However, roads kept getting dug up every now and then. So the focus has always been to sort of put some band-aid solutions and not to actually build good roads, for which good integrated street design guidelines for roads and other public spaces as well are important, and should also include process of standardized contracts as well. So
sorry to interrupt you, Vajna. I just wanted to let you know we're running a little bit short on time, and I'm very keen to make sure that people have a chance to ask you any questions. We've only got about 5 minutes left. So and I do want to make sure that we at least get some questions in. So if you're able to wrap up in a couple of minutes or whatever, I'm not sure where you're up to, that would be fantastic.
Sure, Peter. Yeah, thanks for that heads up. I can try my best to wrap it up soon. Yeah. The third piece was about the issues around constitutional amendment for just 42% as what is being implemented by state, and mayors and councils only have limited role in key municipal functions, just 9 functions listed in 12th schedule of the Constitution have been devolved to city governments by law. Only 8 states actually are empowered to pass city budgets without prior approval from states, and only 12 states can invest their funds without prior approval of states. And this, I mean, as you can see on the RHS, there is also a huge asymmetry of mayoral and council powers across various city categories. Like we'll see in metropolitan cities, while there is a lot more power financially, mayors are actually except in Chennai and Kolkata and Hyderabad, mayors actually have a term that is lesser than 5 years, not coterminous with that of the council. And the other issue of not having robust metropolitan governance system, because the metropolitan planning committees, which are as envisaged by the Constitution, is not often implemented. And the Constitution itself envisaged it as a planning body, and it does not have any more powers or executive authority. So there is a time, I mean, when 74th CA was introduced, we hardly had 2 cities which were mega cities, but that's not the case anymore. And therefore, there is a need to relook at metropolitan governance provisions as well. So we need a constitutional amendment that recognizes cities as distinct unit of governance, which is not currently the case. City governments are a sub-tier of state government, so that's important. And second, we need to reimagine how metropolitan areas in the cities are governed, where we are sort of proposing for a metropolitan authority in line of Greater London Authority or Combined Authority model in 4 million plus cities, and in million plus cities to generally empower mayors and councils, and also have metropolitan planning committees completely functional. And third is to have modern municipal acts and modern city councils with adequate infrastructure support for councils, so that there is more trust and credibility among citizens as well on the councillors and mayors. The next issue is the absence of institutionalized platform for citizen participation. So for which it's very important, first of all, to have disclosure of data, because facilitation of participation is best possible when data and operational and financial information are made available to citizens. But we don't do a great job in terms of public disclosure, and only 11 states in the country has actually adopted open data formats. And as I said before, the implementation of ward committees, which are like the institutional platform for citizen participation cities, has not been in a great shape. Just 22% of cities actually has some level of ward committees functional, and only 3 cities essentially have participatory budgeting process. So what we are basically proposing for is to have implementation of community participation law and public disclosure law, and have open data standards being adopted by city governments, and sort of strengthen the municipal legislations accordingly. The financial performance, the fiscal decentralization aspect is still in a very nascent form. Only one state, Assam, has devolved all power to levy all key taxes. And cities on average are able to generate only 32% of their own revenue, own revenues, and state finance commissions, which decides between fiscal transfers between state and state governments to the local governments, are also quite often delayed and not taken as seriously as the Union Finance Commission. So there's an average delay of 349 days essentially, which also has implications on financial availability and predictability of transfers from state governments to local governments. A very important indicator of the fiscal decentralization availability of revenue sources is one aspect, but another key important aspect is also financial management. So budget variance is a key indicator, and we see that budget variance of 12 cities that we analyze is actually 43% in terms of receipts and 45% in terms of expenditure. So there is generally like an improvement of financial position of city governments through predictable transfers and own revenue enhancement, which is very critical. Similarly, there also has to be a catalyzation of large-scale financing for urban infrastructure through municipal borrowings, which obviously will have to be on the back of a robust framework for financial and performance reporting by city governments. Another important tool is also to have a digital grant management tools for timely transfer of grants from city government, grants from state to city governments. This could also be a mechanism to track fiscal and financial progress of infrastructure projects, as well as to report and monitor based on a single source of trusted data. Very good model for this is the cityfinance.in platform, which MUHA officially adopted and launched in 2020. Essentially, the 15th Finance Commission uses this platform for the grant disbursement to all 4,700 plus cities. It's also a a national platform for ensuring availability of standardized, timely, and credible financial information. So it's a prototype that can sort of be emulated across state governments to their context. The final aspect is the issue of human resource management, where there is a huge vacancy issue, and this vacancy issue sort of progresses, as you can see on the RHS top part, that the vacancy issue sort of aggravates as the city size becomes smaller. And there are 24, most of the states, actually 24 states actually have municipal cadre rules, which means specialized cadre for urban services. However, the rules only mention bare minimum qualifications, things like a detailed job descriptions, or mentioning of detailed qualifications, not just in terms of education, but on other technical managerial aspects are all missing. So, and no city actually has a performance management system. And only 5 states actually have dedicated training institutes for municipal staff. Another observation we also had was that there is a very skewed organizational setup with a very narrow leadership base in different cities. Like, for example, in Karnataka, only 3% of its total staff is dedicated to management and administration of the whole organization. So grade D, the last grade of employees, is essentially much more swollen. And to sort of elegantly resolve for the challenges, especially for smaller cities, what we are proposing to have is, one, to have an overhaul of cadre and recruitment rules, which needs to be comprehensively updated. And secondly is to have a clustered approach to building capacities, because building capacities at every single city government is just not practically possible. So even as we aspire to get there, this could be an interim option. So yeah, on that note, these are the 10 instruments of change that we believe could catalyze urban transformation in India. So thank you.
Vajna, an amazing presentation. Thank you so much for sharing with us. The city system sort of approach and way of thinking, and then the survey itself with so much rich data that's been pulled out of it, and then those instruments that you shared with us at the end are really fascinating, and certainly, obviously, a great tool for the Indian context, but I think for many contexts has a lot of relevance as well. I'm aware of timing, and the agenda was set for an hour. I realized in the calendar that the invite that got sent out was 90 minutes, but we were going to try and keep it as close to an hour as possible. But I'd love for people, if you have questions for Vajna, if you have comments about the city systems approach or the survey, would love to hear them now. Please just put up your hand or jump off mute directly.
Yes, hello. This is Glenn Wright. Can you hear me?
We can, Glenn. Go for it.
Okay. Yes, that's a very, very interesting presentation and so comprehensive. But I guess I have two kind of questions. One is, it's so comprehensive that it would be a huge challenge to do all of those. Is there some priority of these that you would want to do, and where would you get, or how would you get, or how would you develop the political support or whatever is needed to implement these changes or to improve the situation?
Thank you so much, Glenn, for that question. So it's a great question. It's definitely 10 instruments are quite heavy in itself. And like you rightly pointed out, for certain transformation, for certain of these 10 instruments of change, political support is extremely important. And we see that mostly applicable for elements around empowerment of mayors and councils, where in the absence of political will, it's extremely difficult to get anything done. And we also recognize those 3 instruments of change, which is essentially constitutional amendment to empower cities, which will require union government to take effort to evolve consensus with various state governments, which is very, very difficult. And we'll have to sort of wait for the right opportunity and sort of look for such right opportunities as well. It is going to take time. empowered mayors and councils and to have a good metropolitan governance system could also be largely with the state governments, with the current constitutional framework in the country. It's not impossible for state governments to do that. But again, there is always hesitation for state governments to sort of devolve more power. So we see these three aspects a lot more difficult probably to have the political appetite, which we recognize. But we see certain reforms could be far more catalytic, and it will be easier for the political and administrative or bureaucratic ecosystem in the country to pick up. And these are fundamentally financial reforms. An improvement in the revenue sources for the city governments, improvement in their financial management and accountability practices, in turn could sort of catalyze some bit of urban transformation. So we see that as more catalytic in nature and probably something that's more palatable to the ecosystem in that sense, and it's just more catalytic in nature. So in some ways, the prioritization or easierness to sort of drive reforms would say would be in the financial aspect. We are also observing a little bit more appetite in terms of the urban design standards as well. So we have some, with some state governments, we've been able to see that there is a lot more interest, which is naturally, there is a lot more tangibility involved in public design standards, street design standards. So that is another area which could be prioritized. And it is also, again, catalytic in nature and could have sort of a ripple effect across various other things with a direct response to the quality of life in some sense too. Whereas in other cases, it's a little bit more difficult to communicate and sort of build a proof as well, right? So yeah, I mean, I think these would be the much more prioritizable reforms in some sense, simply by considering the palatability to the ecosystem. However, I'm sure as all fellow travelers who truly believe in decentralization, it's in some sense, it's also our duty to sort of keep looking up for that right opportunity and use it when it's there. But just immediately, as you rightly said, could be quite difficult. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks for that response, Vajna. Madhvi, over to you.
Thanks, Rajna. A very interesting presentation. I was part of A6 almost a decade ago, so it's great to see how it's evolved. I was just curious about what you said about the urban-rural continuum, because I think that's a reality of urbanization today. In your research, did you come across examples of good governance when it comes to this urban-rural continuum? Whether it's India or anywhere else? Or is this still a rather nascent area?
Yes, yeah, Madhvi, thanks. So yeah, it is at some level, I would say it is a little nascent area. We did observe some interesting mechanisms in South Africa, for example, but we have not explored it enough to say conclusively in terms of the robustness of that structure, but they do see at least an integrated approach there at district level sort of exist. But the extent to which they are working effectively or not is something we need to explore further. But it'll be quite nice to also look at one interesting example from Kerala, where from administrative standpoint, what they have done is they've sort of created a unified local governance department by bringing together the Department of Panchayat, Department of Rural Development Department, Urban, the Planning Division, and the Engineering Division all together. Because Kerala is one of those states which actually displayed urban-rural continuum for the first time in India. And their attempt was to sort of, they realized that, there is a need to sort of streamline urban and rural together. Again, it's just less than 2 years old. So that's also in process of implementation. So we have to wait for some time to see how that's faring as well. But that's an interesting development in India. Another piece is in Odisha, where there is an urban-rural transition policy that has been made to sort of ensure, it's more from the sense of conversion of a rural area to an urban area, or an upgradation of a smaller city government to a bigger city government, to sort of equip and handhold them with adequate financial infrastructure support to efficiently become or effectively become a better city government. Because otherwise, suddenly when a rural government becomes city government, they just don't know what to do with it. And there's a lot of flux that's involved. So that's another interesting experiment. But again, only the policy is out, implementation hasn't started. So we'll have to wait and see how this, I mean, it'll be really nice to, I think, explore these integrated place-based approach, because there is, I'm sure you would also recognize that there is a recognition that there is a need for an integrated place-based governance system.
Veena, did you want to jump in? Go for it.
Yeah, I have a, thank you very much. I have a question. Like, I work extensively with panchayats, so in rural governance, and my observation is like, even after 30 years of 73rd amendment of the policy in place, we still are not able to make the elected women members very responsible to their roles. So we still have the proxy systems in place where the male spouses or the male relatives of the elected women members, they function instead of those women. So I just wanted to ask that, was this the same case even with the urban councillors and the mayors? Because the biggest challenge that I see is that the development and also the finance allocations are getting skewed towards a very general issues, and those issues do not have that gender lens, and it's actually getting very generalized, like all infrastructure things will be taken, very concrete cemented infrastructures will be built, but the soft components of development are not taken into consideration. So did Janagra observe the same thing also in context to urban governance?
Yeah, thanks, Veena, for that question, and totally aligned with your observations. And we did, we actually undertook another study called the City Leaders Study, where we were actually looking into the need for a systematic leadership development program for councillors with a focus on women councillors. So in that study, we actually recognized that the proxy system does exist in the urban context as well in India. And there was, and like you rightly said, gender lens sort of, especially focus on development projects, social development projects, especially focus on health, education, for example, are things that sort of women tend to focus a lot more. And because of the reservation mandate through the constitution, a lot of women enter into city politics, a lot of them without any prior political background. So it becomes really, really important for them to be equipped well to handle the role. And a lot of them had to actually struggle through, the patriarchal structures to sort of, assert their position, identity in city council. So we also saw a little bit of a variation in the system of proxy, or rather the extent of proxies across North and South as well. So there is, we sort of observed that it is a lot more prevalent and stronger perhaps in the North. It's not that it doesn't exist in the southern part of India, but it's slightly relatively lower. We saw women who actually struggled quite a bit in the first year, but some of them actually made a massive progress and sort of like asserted their position very well, and also learned very well on the job. And they're able to make their voice heard for their ward in the city council. But we also met, a couple of women where they sort of struggled, where they sort of felt that women were not able to, just because of the gender, they're not basically able to get a space or voice and agency in the council. And so it's basically what the conclusion of the study was, that every single woman basically said that there is importance for a leadership development program for women to sort of, boost their confidence and their ability to have research support for them to sort of, articulate the demands and needs of their ward in the city council confidently. And they actually requested for, some of them requested for a secretariat kind of a support, which is what you're also seeing in our recommendations on empowerment of mayors and councils, because it's not just through legislations, but you also need to equip them to deal with their roles well. And it's definitely the focus has to be a little bit more on women councillors, because what our study also observed is that while most of the men councillors who came into this job, even though it's their first time, they were all from much more educated background. They also had prior work experience, but a lot of women did not have that kind of educational background or zero work experience at all. Like I'm saying, any other kind of work experience, not just political experience. So there was like a 100% consensus on a leadership development program of that nature with proper infrastructure support to sort of aid their research and ability to voice in the council. And they also sort of highlighted that there should be some level of gender sensitization that generally happens across all genders as well. So that was another finding. So we are actually in the process of, the seeding phase is somewhat done, but we're now in the process of sort of re-strategizing to bring a city leadership development program with a focus on women councillors now.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Veena, and thanks for the response, Vajna. I think recognizing the time, we'll wrap up there. But Vajna, thank you so much for coming and sharing. We're really, really grateful. A great opportunity for us to learn about the ASIC's survey in particular. Can I also just thank my co-chairs and also to Lima for all the assistance in putting together this session today as well. It's much appreciated. Do keep an eye out on social media for next steps in this working group. We will have more to say in the coming weeks about that. But otherwise, thank you all for joining, and we look forward to staying in touch in the future. We'll see you later.